Hello. In this video on reading photography, we will discuss the interpretation of photography. And for this we will have recourse to the theories of Roland Barthes. Now we selected this photograph of the so-called Windrush generation. Now maybe first to correctly interpret this kind of photograph, a documentary photograph, is the historical context, which you always, of course, want to take into account. After the war, in the 50s, the British government invited people from the Caribbean to move into the UK to find jobs in industry and to help rebuild the country. Promises were made of a bright future in what was supposed to be an ever-growing economy after the war effort in the UK. And many of these people moved into the UK to build their lives there. Now, when we look at this photo, we have to notice a few elements that are a bit at odds with the historical context. First of all, we should note that this image is staged. The photo is just too good to be a natural photo. It is evident that the photographer has very carefully done a mise en scène to try to convey a message. And for this he has positioned the subject in a certain way and tried to capture something. Now, to hint at this idea of the bright future, the subjects are looking in the direction of where the train is heading. And this exemplifies, of course, the promise of the travel to a new existence. The child plays in this setup an important role as it holds the promise to this future. An oddity may be that while the UK was in fact looking to strengthen its workforce, the people in this picture are clearly middle class, to say the least. They are also something that people who have ever traveled in the UK by train will have noticed immediately. They are also traveling in first class with a nice cup of tea. So we are targeting here more what these people would become to be than what the reality was of the migrants arriving in the UK. And this is a first important element in Roland Barthes' theory. Barthes explains to us that people are never just portrayed as who they are, but mostly as who they want to be or how they want to be perceived. How, in this case, the photographer or even maybe the magazine, the authority that paid for this photograph, wanted these people to be portrayed. It could be government propaganda to stimulate this program and to make it popular with the targeted audiences. So this element of photographing not always just showing what is there and who is there, but who people want to be, what their aspirations are, what their fears are. And in the 50s we will clearly see this in a lot of photography. Certainly the fears, because by the end of the 50s the Cold War would get its grip like a dark winter over Europe, and fear for confrontation and even later atomic warfare would be a primary concern. So many of these pictures would try to capture this fear. Here we have the promise of the rebuilding of Europe and this idea of a shared common future, an open future, open to all. Historians will note that the fate of the Windrush generation was not all a walk in the park, and that certainly in the later decades of the 20th century their living conditions were far from optimal and a far cry from what has been depicted here. Now, Roland Barthes will also try to explain that we will have to look in a photograph for this element that triggers the affect in the photo. And this is indeed the real power of photography. It presents itself as a realistic documentary medium, but in fact it has a magic inside. It portrays realities that are not there, that exist only in our minds. And the affect is what binds us to the photograph and gives this immediate emotion. This makes photography also very ideal in educational contexts, because the real maturity, the real insight can only start with an emotional bond. And the photographer has here very well chosen to portray a family with a protecting husband, the child holding a prospect of a bright future and a safe future. Now, back to 2020. I think our perspectives on this photography, and when we look at the 50s photography, we are a little bit bemused, and certainly younger generations who have no connection with this era at all. And I think many of today's scholars will point to a hidden gender coding present in this photograph. It is certainly the case that in many photographs of the 50s, the man is in a protective position of the woman. In this case, he's leaning over the women, but you will find many, many more photographs of this nature in 50s photography. The woman feels clearly secured, is safe, holds her kid nearby. So this is all the gender coding that is very typical of that era. And I think in photography of the 21st century, we will see, of course, other relations, other encodings. So I hope with this little background of what Roland Barthes has to say to us, and with some general considerations on the relevance of the historical context and the scenarization, the mise en scène of the photographer, you are helped in analyzing the photos you will see.